If you want to know about the literature of any country, firstly we should know about its history. The same with the literature of Great Britain. The literature of Great Britain dates back to the ancient history of this great country. In the 1st century before Christ, the land that is now called England was called Great Britain. And the main residents of this land were Celts, and the language they spoke was the Celtic or Celtic in some sources. The ancient Celts or Celts were quite a primitive people who led quite a primitive lifestyle. They lived out of fishing and eating flesh of their cattle. They weaved different coarse clothes for themselves, and they believed that different gods lived in different forests. And another tribes that lived in this area were Gaels, and the tribes of Gaels were separated from Britons and located in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Well, the Celts and Gaels had very strange religion, and they called themselves as Druids. It was quite a strange religion with its strange traditions, like they buried animals with human beings. And besides, there were some plants that considered very sacred, and these were mistletoes and oak tree. Some elements of this religion still remain in the land of Great Britain. For example, sacred plant mistletoe still hung in the houses of Great Britain during New Year Eve. Later, the lifestyle and culture of ancient Britain little bit changed with the invasion of Roman Empire. In 55 before the Christ, Julius Caesar, the emperor of Roman Empire, have heard from the travelers that very luxurious and very expensive metal was found in the land of ancient Britain. And he later settled up different camps of troops in the lands of Great Britain. And most cities in Britain were developed from these camps. In 55 before Christ, Romans totally invaded the land of ancient Britain. And Romans were considered as very practical men. They were very skillful in building bridges, big roads and multi-storied buildings. And they taught the people of Great Britain to build this kind of elements of building in their houses. They were quite a practical men, and they were also very good warriors. They spoke Latin language, and therefore Latin language had a great influence on the development of the Celtic language. The invasion of the Roman Empire lasted up to 5th century, to be precise, up to 407. Later, during this period, there was great need to protect their own lands, and therefore Roman warriors just left Great Britain to protect their own lands in Rome, in Italy. And later, in 410, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invaded most parts of the Great Britain. And this invasion was called Anglo-Saxon invasion. Their languages were Anglo-Saxon, and the dominant population of Britain was moved to the east and north of Great Britain, to such places like Ireland and Scotland. Anglo-Saxons made a settlement in the center of Great Britain. At the beginning of the 4th century, Anglo-Saxons were pagans. They believed in different gods, and they have different gods. For example, the Thor was the name of the Thunderer, or the Freya was the name of the goddess of Freya. The sun was another another Anglo-Saxon god. And later they gave the names of the weeks with the names of their gods. And their religion lasted up to 7th century. They were pagans, and later, with the influence of Roman religion, they changed their religion into Christianity. However, during the reign of Roman Empire, there were some elements of Christianity in Great Britain, because Constantine, who was one of the emperors of Roman Empire, established Christianity in 306 in Rome, and the same religion had an impact on the Great Britain during the reign of Roman Empire. And therefore there was some people who trusted Christianity. However, with the invasion of Anglo-Saxons, these Christians were converted again to paganism. But later, in the 7th century, there were some Italian monks who visited Great Britain, who visited England in order to convert them to Christianity. And during this period, Britain's name was England, that is derived from the Anglo-Saxon tribes' name, like Angles, Sacs, and Jutes. And starting from the 7th century, the official religion of Great Britain was Christian religion. And if we rely on the statistics and the data that was provided by historians, the first monks from Italy who visited Great Britain in order to establish their religion was the city of Kent. And the first church was called Canterbury Church. And even nowadays, Canterbury is considered one of the greatest religious centers of Great Britain. And with the impact of Christianity, there was again the growth of Latin language. And most educated people learn Latin language in order to study the religion and establish different rules of the religion during this period. Well, and the most important religion was called Catholic Church, and from the Latin language it was translated like Catholic Universal and Church Religion. And starting from 306, this religion covered the most European countries, including Great Britain, of course. And most people during this period started to write their first writing poems or epics and different other types of literary works related to the Christianity or their saint deeds. And these kind of writers were considered as scribes. Scribere is taken from Latin language that means to write. And besides, Anglo-Saxon invasion make a start to the literature of Great Britain. For example, with the appearance of such Scandinavian sagas like Beowulf, and with its monsters and dragons, and the elements in the literature like very brave knights or very brave kings, and the elements of flying dragons who pour the fire from their mouths is considered as Scandinavian sagas that we can see in the elements of even modern types of literature. In even the up-to-date literature, we can see the elements of such an ancient types of literature that is now classified as a literature of fantasy. Besides, as I mentioned, there was again the impact of Latin language in the population who wanted to be well educated and studied in different monasteries, where the main courses of education were about religion, rhetorics, philosophy, and so on. The first literary works were provided by scribes, and one of the common scribes were Bede, who firstly started to describe the history of English priests, and the works of the beads are considered the first type of history that was developed in Great Britain. Later, the King Alfred, who had very constant defeat with Danes, translated the works of the bead into the language that the population of Great Britain, could read. And King Alfred was quite a strong soldier, quite a strong warrior, but he wanted to change the life of the people who lived in his country. And the wars when he participated were the wars with Danes, and this war was dedicated to only protect the lands of England, rather than invading different places. And during the lifetime, King Alfred made a great contribution to the development of literature and academy in Great Britain. However, after the death of King Alfred, the Danes again invaded some parts of England and were total invaders of this land. Some warriors of the Danes also invaded the north of France, and when they totally had a reign in this northern part of France, they called themselves like Normans. This was a mixture of Danes who spoke mainly Anglo-Saxon language that is slightly different from Anglo-Saxons who invaded Great Britain before. But Normans had a little bit different dialect, and with the mixture of French language, they had different language from French language that is called Norman language. And they were also called Norsemen or Vikings. And at the beginning of the 12th and 13th century, there was a total reign of Normans. However, the invasion by Normans dates back to the beginning of the 11th century. In 1066, the warrior called William, at the Battle of Hastings, defeated the soldiers of Great Britain, and after this battle they had some troops who had a reign in the lands of Great Britain. After the invasion of the William Conqueror, there was a change in the infrastructure and the ruling class of England. William Conqueror just divided the lands of Anglo-Saxons to his own barons, and after this period the first roots of feudalism started to be established in the land of Great Britain. And there were lots of taxes that were posed to very poor people like peasants, craftsmen and others. And this phase gave a development to ballads and different songs that were related about the work and deeds of these barons, how they were cruel towards poor and old people, about their very expensive and heartless taxes. And one of the prominent ballads of this period was a ballad about Robin Hood and others. The influence of the Normandy, however, had also some advantages. For example, in 1868, there are some scholars who were from Europe, mainly from French. They established the first university in Great Britain, the University of Oxford. And in 1209, there was establishment of university at Cambridge. And during this period, France was a center of education, and therefore lots of people from different parts of Europe just went to France in order to be educated. And scholars from this region established the first universities in Great Britain. During the Norman conquest, there were three languages in use. The ordinary people, common people, still tried to use their Anglo-Saxon language, whereas the language of court and law, they use the Norman language that was called the Chancery Standard. All documentation, official papers were established and created were written in only Norman language. However, the language of education was still Latin and Greek. Latin and Greek was the main language of education, like rhetorics, philosophy, grammar, and different other sciences were studied in these languages. However, at the end of the 13th century, most writers started to write their own works in Anglo-Saxon language. And one of these kind of very famous writers is considered Geoffrey Chaucer. At first, he started his works writing in Latin, then he created his works in Norman language. After being popular, Geoffrey Chaucer started to use Anglo-Saxon language. And if we later in our presentation will talk about the appearance of Renaissance, during exactly at this time, the first details of English Renaissance started to exist with the works of Geoffrey Chaucer. The influence of Normans had also great value in the development of English literature. For example, it was very common to write about the defeats of knights, about the defeats of brave lords, brave kings, and about their affairs with young and beautiful ladies. This was a common feature of the French literature that was implemented into English literature. For example, the epic poem by Thomas Malory about the King Arthur and his knights and about his round table. There was the description of different defeats and deeds of his brave knights where they gathered in the city of the Arthur, and about their love affairs with different princesses and so on. And this kind of style in writing was considered as romances. The development of romances dates back to the 12th and 13th century. The influence of Norman literature that has also deep root and profound influence in English literature. Besides the literature, different types of romances, there was another type of writings in English literature. For example, the priest of Anglican Church, William Langland and John Wycliffe. They were priests and wandered from one village to another village by urging people to abandon the taxes that was installed by Anglican Church. It was the rules of Roman Church that was also established by a Roman Pope, and they urged people to reject these taxes and to fight against Anglican Church. And therefore, during this period, English kingdoms divided into two parts. There was a war of roses that lasted for 100 years. The War of Roses. This was a war about the York and Lancaster. The Yorkists had a red rose in their flags, and Lancaster, they had a white rose in their flags. The Lancaster fought for installing taxes on poor peasants. They wanted to enrich their treasures with taxes, whereas Yorkists were against the church, and they just wanted to abandon all these taxes. And at the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century, there was the end of this war, and new king Henry VII established his kingdom in Great Britain. That was the time where Tudor dynasty, who was considered Anglo-Saxons, established their absolute kingdom over Great Britain. And later there was a Queen Elizabeth. There was a Queen Elizabeth who established her own reign. And this period, starting from 15th up to 17th century, was a period of renaissance of Great Britain. However, a renaissance in Europe developed quite earlier, at 12th and 13th century. And starting from 12th up to 17th century, there was a time of Renaissance, the time of rebirth. What are the distinctive features of Renaissance? It was translated as rebirth. Everything has changed during this period. This was the Renaissance of culture, the Renaissance of literature and architecture. They inspired with the works, with architecture, literature of the medieval age, with the works of such geniuses like Petrarch, Dante, Michelangelo, and the famous representatives of European Renaissance is considered Copernicus. For example, the works of Copernicus in astrology really shattered the value and importance of Catholic Church. And afterwards, there was another types of directions in Christian religion, like Protestants and other types. The writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer or Thomas Malory or William Shakespeare got inspiration from the works of Italian writers like Petrarch, Dante or Giovanni Boccaccio. And the most of works of English writers, when we read the works of these writers, we may see that most works were influenced by the writers of Italy, who worked during the 12th or 13th century. In the main sense, in their works was inspiring people towards the value of humanity, and therefore these writers were considered humanists. And one of the prominent authors of humanism was considered Thomas More. And different directions in the literature started to develop in Great Britain, starting from writing the poems in different genres like fabliaux or fables, sonnets, and others. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer gave a start to writing a prose. Some of his works considered as poems, and some works will look like a prose. And the works of William Shakespeare was very popular during this period, and England was prominent with its famous authors like them. Later, in the 16th century, there was a time of enlightenment, and during this period, despite the fame of such writers that we mentioned before, majority of population of Great Britain still remained ignorant. And most kings who reigned during this period struggled to have only power around the world, and England's purpose was to become one of the central powers of trade around the world. And therefore there was a development of industry, there was high taxes on poor peasants, and therefore some population stayed still ignorant. Besides, with the development of technology, there was such very famous rebellions like Nazi revolt. With the appearance of weaving machine, there was a revolt of merchants who worked in factory. They blamed these kind of machines in their misery, and there was a revolt against these kind of machines and the heads of these kind of factories. And during 17th and 18th century, there was a revolution that was called Industrial Revolution, the revolution of poor people, the revolution of ordinary people who fought against injustice in their life. And the appearance of this industrial revolution, the poor conditions of ordinary people, contributed to development of pamphlets, to development of newspaper, to development of first printing press. However, the origin of establishing printing press dates back in Germany, but later in the 17th century, the printing press also developed in Great Britain, and first English newspapers started to appear in Great Britain also. And the first writers of this period started to develop their prose in a realistic genre that was called the first examples of realism. They are Henry Fielding, and the appearance of such works of pre-romanticism, for example, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Paul, and other writers. And the main purpose of these writers was to draw back attention of poor people who struggled with their life from ugly atmosphere towards beautiful dreams and desires that they wanted to live. And all this was depicted in their works. This was the first elements of Romanticism and pre-Romanticism, with the elements of mystery, with the elements of fantasy and beautiful style of life. And the information that is provided in our today's lesson is related to the 1st century from Anno Domini up to 18th century. And in other further lessons, we'll continue to talk about such a beautiful literature of Great Britain that will relate it to the 19th, 20th and 21st century. Thank you for your attention.